The dust hadn't settled from the stagecoach wheels when Margaret Doyle stepped down onto the hard-packed earth of Red Hollow. Her worn leather boots touched ground that seemed to shimmer with heat, even as the October sun began its descent behind the jagged mountains. She clutched a small carpetbag in one hand and pressed the other against her ribs, where an old wound still ached when the weather changed. The driver tossed her trunk down with little ceremony. "This is as far as I go. Miss, Red Hollow ain't much, but it's all there is for 50 miles in any direction." Margaret nodded, handing him the last of her coins. She watched the stagecoach lumber away, leaving her standing alone on what passed for the town's main street. Red Hollow stretched before her, a collection of weathered buildings that seemed to huddle together against the vastness of the frontier. The saloon dominated one side, its bat-wing doors swinging lazily. Across from it stood a general store, a blacksmith's shop, and what appeared to be a small eating establishment with faded curtains in the windows. She had traveled for 3 weeks to reach this place, sleeping in way stations and cheap boarding houses, each mile taking her further from the blood-soaked battlefields where she'd spent the last 4 years. The war was over, but its ghosts still haunted her dreams. Out here, she hoped to find something the East couldn't offer a chance to disappear, to become someone new. The eating house bore a simple sign, "Martha's Kitchen." Margaret pushed open the door, setting off a small bell. The interior was dim but clean, with 6 tables covered in checkered cloth and a long counter where 2 men hunched over their coffee. A woman emerged from the back, wiping flour-dusted hands on her apron. She was perhaps 40, with graying hair pulled back severely and tired eyes that had seen too much. "We're closing soon," the woman said, then paused, taking in Margaret's travel-stained dress and the exhaustion written on her face. "Though I suppose I could fix you something quick." "I'm not here for food," Margaret said, straightening her spine despite her weariness. "I'm looking for work. I can cook, clean, and I have experience with medical matters." The woman, Martha, presumably studied her with sharp interest. "You're not from around here." "Pennsylvania, originally, most recently from—" Margaret hesitated. "From various army camps." "A nurse." "Among other things." Martha's expression softened slightly. "The war sent a lot of folks wandering. Can you really cook?" "Yes, ma'am. I learned from the camp cooks. Had to feed wounded men who'd lost their appetite for living. You learn to make even hardtack taste like something worth eating." A ghost of a smile crossed Martha's face. "I lost my husband at Antietam. Been running this place alone since—" She glanced toward the back. "I could use help, especially with winter coming. The miners eat here regular, and they're not gentlefolk. Can you handle rough men?" Margaret's jaw tightened. "I've held dying soldiers' intestines in place while the surgeon worked. I believe I can manage miners. Pay's not much, $1 a day plus meals. There's a room above the kitchen. It's small and gets cold, but it's private." "I'll take it." Martha nodded slowly. "You can start tomorrow. Dawn comes early here." She paused, then added, "One more thing. You'll be boarding next to the Apache." Margaret blinked. "I beg your pardon." "Got a small cabin attached to the back of this building. Been renting it these past 2 months to an Indian. Coda, he calls himself. Keeps to himself, pays in pelts and gold dust. But folks don't like it. They'll tell you to stay clear of him." "And you, what do you tell me?" Martha's eyes were unreadable. "I tell you, he pays his rent and hasn't caused trouble, but he's not sociable, doesn't speak much English, or pretends not to. Works in the forest, comes and goes at odd hours. Some say he's a scout for the army, others say worse things." "I'll manage," Margaret said simply. Martha showed her to the room, a narrow space with a cot, a washstand, and a single window that looked out onto a scrub-filled yard. Through the thin wall, Margaret could hear movement in the adjacent cabin. Heavy footsteps, the scrape of a chair. "That's him," Martha said unnecessarily. "Lock your door at night. Not saying he's dangerous, but, well, lock your door." After Martha left, Margaret unpacked her few possessions. 3 dresses, all practical, her medical instruments, wrapped carefully in oilcloth, a leather journal filled with notes and sketches from the war, and hidden in the lining of her bag, papers she'd copied from a dead supply officer's desk, shipping manifests and coded messages she hadn't yet fully deciphered, but which had led her west. As darkness fell, she stood at her window, watching the last light fade from the sky. A figure moved in the yard below, tall, broad-shouldered, walking with the fluid grace of someone who belonged to the land. He paused at a water pump, and, in the dim light, she caught a glimpse of long dark hair, a face carved from shadow and stone. Their eyes met across the distance. His were black as the growing night, unblinking and cold. Margaret didn't look away. She'd stared down death too many times to be intimidated by a hard gaze. After a long moment, he turned and disappeared into his cabin. The door closed with finality. Margaret pulled the thin curtains shut and began preparing for bed. Through the wall, she could hear him moving about the clink of metal, the splash of water. Such ordinary sounds, yet they seemed loud in the frontier silence. She thought of the warning, "Stay away from him. Lock your door." But Margaret had learned to read danger in men's eyes, and what she'd seen in his wasn't threat. It was something else, something she recognized from her own reflection, the look of someone who'd traveled far to escape something that couldn't be outrun. The next morning came too soon, announced by Martha's sharp knock. Margaret dressed quickly and descended to find the kitchen already warm with fire. Martha showed her the routine biscuits and gravy for the miners, strong coffee, beans, and salt pork, simple food for hard men. They'll start arriving soon. Martha warned, "Keep your eyes down and your responses short. Some of them haven't seen a young woman in months." The first customers were already waiting when Margaret opened the doors. They filed in, dusty and rough, filling the small space with a smell of earth and sweat. She served them efficiently, dodging crude comments and grasping hands with practiced ease. It was near noon when the conversation turned to her neighbor. "Saw that Indian skulking around again last night," one miner said, spitting tobacco juice into a tin cup. "Don't know why Martha allows it." "Bad for business," another agreed. "Having one of them so close, they're all thieves and worse." Margaret kept her expression neutral as she refilled their coffee. Through the kitchen window, she caught sight of the man in question. He was loading supplies onto a pack horse, his movements economical and sure. In daylight, she could see him more clearly, perhaps 30 years old, wearing a mix of traditional dress and white man's clothing. A rifle rested against his leg, and a knife hung at his belt. "You best be careful, miss," the first miner said, noticing her gaze. "That one's killed before. You can see it in how he moves." "Thank you for your concern," Margaret said coolly, turning away. The afternoon passed in a blur of dishes and demanding customers. By evening, her feet ached and her hands were raw from hot water. Martha counted out her $1, nodding approval. "You did well, better than the last girl who tried." "What happened to her?" Martha's face darkened. "Ran off with some traveling man, or so she said in her note." She paused. "That was 6 months ago." Something in her tone made Margaret look up sharply, but Martha was already turning away. That night, Margaret sat on her narrow bed, studying her journal by candlelight. The coded messages seemed to dance before her tired eyes, references to shipments, to a man called C. Yazurar, to merchandise that would fetch high prices in California, and repeatedly mentions of Red Hollow as a waypoint. A sound from next door made her freeze a low groan, quickly stifled. She waited, listening. Another sound, like something being dragged across the floor. Before she could think better of it, Margaret was at her door. The yard was empty, lit by a slice of moon. The Apache's cabin showed a faint glow through one window. She knocked softly. The sounds inside ceased abruptly. "Are you hurt?" she called quietly. The door yanked open. He filled the doorway, and she could smell blood. His shirt was torn, revealing a deep gash across his ribs. In his hand, he held a needle and thread. They stared at each other, up close. She could see the planes of his face more clearly, strong bones, a mouth set in a hard line, and those dark eyes that seemed to look through her. "Go," he said, the word heavily accented but clear. "You're doing it wrong," Margaret said, nodding at the needle. "The angle, you'll never close it properly." His eyes narrowed. "Go," he repeated, more forcefully. "I was an army nurse. I've sewn up worse wounds than that." She met his gaze steadily. "Let me help." For a moment, she thought he might slam the door in her face. Then, without a word, he stepped back. The cabin was sparse but clean. A bedroll in one corner, a few pelts hanging on the walls, cooking implements by the small fireplace, and blood more than she'd expected soaking through a pile of rags. "Sit," she said, moving toward him. He remained standing, watching her warily. Margaret sighed. "Fine, stand if you must, but I need light and hot water." Slowly, as if moving might spook her, he lit another candle and set a pot of water on the fire. Margaret examined the wound, a clean cut, but deep, from a knife, most likely. "This needs cleaning first," she said. When he didn't respond, she took his silence as agreement. She worked quickly and efficiently, aware of his tension, the way his muscles coiled ready to spring, but he didn't flinch as she cleaned the wound, didn't make a sound as she began to stitch. "You should report this," she said quietly. "Whoever did this." "No." The word was final, brooking no argument. Margaret continued her work in silence. When she finished, she stepped back. "Keep it clean. Change the bandage daily. I can..." "Go now." This time, she didn't argue. She gathered her supplies and moved to the door. As she reached for the handle, his voice stopped her. "Why?" She turned back. He was watching her with that unreadable expression. "Why help?" Margaret considered the question. "Because you needed it," she said simply. Something flickered in his eyes, surprise, perhaps, or suspicion. Then his face closed off again. "Do not come back," he said. Margaret nodded and left, closing the door softly behind her. But as she crossed the yard to her own room, she knew she would be back. There were too many questions about his wound, about what he did in the forest, about why a man who clearly wanted no attention would choose to live in the middle of a hostile town. And somewhere in this maze of mysteries, she sensed, lay the answers she'd come west to find. The days that followed settled into an uneasy rhythm. Margaret rose before dawn to prepare the kitchen, served the rough miners their meals, and collapsed into bed each night with aching feet and flour under her fingernails. Through it all, she was acutely aware of the presence next door, the occasional footfall, the scrape of a whetstone on steel, the silence that seemed to emanate from his cabin like a living thing. She didn't approach him again, respecting his clear desire for solitude, but she watched, as she had learned to watch during the war, cataloging details that might prove important. He left before sunrise most days, returning at dusk with game slung over his shoulder or bundles of herbs that he dried on his porch. He spoke to no one, bought his supplies from the general store in terse transactions that sent the shopkeeper's wife scurrying to the back room. The townspeople's hostility toward him was palpable. Men spat when he passed. Women clutched their children closer. And yet he moved through it all with a kind of impervious dignity, neither acknowledging their hatred nor seeming affected by it. It was a Wednesday evening, 2 weeks after her arrival, when Margaret witnessed the full extent of that animosity. She was scrubbing the last of the dinner pots when she heard the commotion outside, raised voices, the sound of breaking glass. Through the kitchen window, she saw a group of miners gathered in the yard, passing a bottle between them. Their target stood near the water pump, his back straight despite the ring of hostile faces. "Think you're too good to drink with white men," one of them slurred, waving the bottle at Coda. He said nothing, merely shifted his weight slightly, a subtle movement that somehow made the space around him seem larger, more dangerous. "Jake asked you a question. Indian," another man said, stepping forward. Margaret recognized him as Tom Garrett, a regular at the restaurant who always let his hands linger too long when she served his coffee. Still, Coda remained silent, his dark eyes moving from face to face with the watchfulness of a man counting threats. "Maybe he don't understand English." Jake laughed, the sound ugly with drink. "Let me speak his language." He lunged forward, swinging the bottle like a club. Coda moved not away, but into the attack, one hand deflecting the bottle while the other drove into Jake's stomach. The miner doubled over, gasping. For a moment, nobody moved. Then they all surged forward at once. Margaret didn't remember deciding to act. One moment she was watching through the window. The next, she was bursting through the back door, Martha's shotgun in her hands. "That's enough," she shouted, cocking the weapon with a decisive click. The men froze, turning to stare at her. In the sudden stillness, she could hear Jake wheezing on the ground. "Miss Doyle?" Tom Garrett said, attempting a smile that looked more like a leer. "This ain't your concern." "5 armed men attacking one seems very much my concern," Margaret replied, keeping the shotgun steady. During the war, she'd learned that men rarely expected a woman to actually shoot. The key was to look like you'd already made the decision to pull the trigger. "We were just teaching him some manners," another miner protested. "With a bottle to the head, how civilized!" Her voice dripped contempt. "I suggest you gentlemen find your manners elsewhere. Now." They hesitated, looking between her and Coda, who hadn't moved from his defensive stance. Margaret could feel the violence still crackling in the air, waiting for a spark. "You heard the lady." Martha's voice came from behind her. The older woman stood in the doorway, a pistol in her weathered hand. "Git and Jake, you can find somewhere else to eat from now on. I don't serve cowards who need 4 friends to find their courage." Grumbling and casting dark looks back, the men dispersed. Jake needed help to stand. One arm clutched around his middle. As they shambled away, Tom Garrett paused, his eyes finding Margaret's. "You're making a mistake, miss, choosing the wrong side." "The only side I choose is my own," Margaret replied evenly. After they were gone, Martha lowered her pistol with a sigh. "You've done it now, girl. They won't forget this." "Neither will I," Margaret said, finally lowering the shotgun. Her hands were steady, another gift from the war. She turned to where Coda stood, still as stone in the gathering darkness. A thin line of blood ran from a cut on his cheek, where flying glass had caught him. "You're hurt," she said. His eyes moved from Martha to Margaret, unreadable in the dim light. Then, without a word, he turned and walked to his cabin. The door closed with quiet finality. "Proud," Martha murmured. "Too proud to say thank you. Too proud to show weakness. It'll get him killed one day." "He was defending himself," Margaret said. "That's not how they'll tell it." Martha shook her head. "Come on, let's get inside before they decide to come back." That night, Margaret lay awake listening to the sounds from next door. She could hear him moving about, the splash of water cleaning his wound. She supposed part of her wanted to knock, to insist on checking the cut, but she remembered the look in his eyes, the wall of pride and solitude he'd built around himself. She understood that wall. She'd built one of her own. The next morning brought a new tension to the restaurant. The miners who came for breakfast were subdued, but she could feel their eyes following her, could hear the muttered conversations that stopped when she approached. Jake's friends glared at her openly, though they kept their hands to themselves. It was just past noon when she found the first gift. She'd stepped out to empty the wash water and nearly tripped over it a rabbit, freshly cleaned and dressed, laid carefully on the back step. There was no note, nothing to indicate who had left it, but she knew. She looked toward his cabin, but the door was shut. No sign of movement within. After a moment's hesitation, she picked up the rabbit and brought it inside. "What's that?" Martha asked, looking up from her ledgers. "Payment for medical services, I think," Margaret said. Martha's eyebrows rose, but she said nothing. The gifts continued. Every few days, something would appear: a string of fish, a bundle of wild herbs that made the best tea she'd ever tasted, a deer haunch that fed them for a week. Never when she could see him leave it, never with any acknowledgement. But she began leaving things in return: fresh bread wrapped in cloth, a jar of preserves, once a pair of thick socks she'd knitted during the long evenings. They never spoke of it. On the rare occasions when their paths crossed in the yard, he would nod the slightest dip of his head and she would nod back. It was a conversation without words, an understanding built on small gestures and shared silence. But the town's hostility grew. She heard the whispers that she was his woman, that she'd been corrupted, that no decent white woman would associate with an Indian. Tom Garrett was the worst, his suggestions becoming more explicit each time he came to eat. "Heard you been real neighborly with that Apache," he said one morning, leaning too close as she poured his coffee. "Maybe you'd like to be neighborly with a white man for a change." "Step back, Mr. Garrett," she said coolly. "Come on now, don't be like that. I could show you a real good time. Better than whatever that savage—" The coffee pot connected with his jaw with a satisfying crack. He reeled back, coffee soaking his shirt, his hand going to his face. You hit me?" "Yes," Margaret agreed. "And I'll do it again if you don't leave. Now." He lurched to his feet, rage modeling his face. "You'll regret this. You and your Indian both." After he stormed out, Martha appeared from the kitchen, having watched the whole exchange. "That was foolish," she said, though there was approval in her eyes. "Tom Garrett has friends, influence. He supplies equipment to half the mines around here." "Then perhaps they should find someone who can supply equipment without being a pig," Margaret said, her hand still gripping the coffee pot. That night, she was closing up the restaurant when she heard a sound from next door that made her blood run cold. Not the usual quiet movements, but something desperate, pained. A crash, like furniture overturning. She grabbed the medical bag she always kept ready. Old habits died hard and rushed outside. His door was ajar, lamplight spilling out into the darkness. "Hello," she called, pushing the door wider. The scene inside made her stomach lurch. Coda was on his knees, one hand pressed to his side where fresh blood seeped between his fingers. His knife lay on the floor beside him, blade dark with someone else's blood. The furniture was indeed overturned, and the window at the back was broken. Glass scattered across the floor. "Get out!" he gasped, the words thick with pain. "Not a chance," Margaret said, already kneeling beside him. "Let me see." He tried to pull away, but the movement made him gasp, his face going gray. "Stop being stubborn and let me help," she snapped, using the same tone that had gotten through to delirious soldiers. "Or would you rather bleed to death just to preserve your pride?" Something in her voice must have reached him. Slowly, he moved his hand, revealing a deep puncture wound just below his ribs. Not immediately fatal, but serious enough. "Who did this?" she asked, already working to stop the bleeding. "Does not matter." "It does if they're coming back." His eyes flickered to the broken window. "Not tonight. I discourage them." Despite everything, she almost smiled. Discouraged. She supposed that was one word for it. She worked in silence, cleaning and binding the wound with practiced efficiency. This close, she could see the other scars that marked his body, old wounds. Some from bullets, others from blades. Whatever his story, it had been written in violence. "This needs stitching," she said finally. Again. This time, he didn't protest. She prepared her needle, aware of how still he'd gone, how carefully he controlled his breathing. Pride, she thought, too proud to show pain, even now. "The war, he said suddenly, surprising her. "You were there." It wasn't a question. She nodded, not pausing in her work. "I also," he said, "scouted for the army. They promised." He stopped, jaw tightening. "They promised a lot of things," Margaret finished quietly, "and delivered on very few." Their eyes met for a moment, a flash of shared understanding passing between them. "Is that why you're here?" she asked. "Running from broken promises." "Running, searching, both." His voice was getting thinner. Blood loss, she realized, more than she'd initially thought. "Stay awake," she commanded, working faster. "Tell me what you're searching for." His eyes had started to drift shut, but they opened again at her sharp tone. "Sister," he said. "Taken, sold, trail led here, then—" He gestured weakly. "Then vanished," Margaret said, her hands stilling for just a moment. "Like others." His gaze sharpened despite his weakness. "You know, I suspect," she said carefully, "young women have gone missing. The authorities claim they ran off, but—" "But you do not believe?" "No, I don't." She finished the stitching, bound the wound tightly. He'd need rest, fluids, and prayer that infection didn't set in. But he would live, she thought. Men like him were hard to kill. "You should sleep," she said, gathering her supplies. "I'll check on you in a few hours." His hand caught her wrist as she stood not hard, just enough to stop her. His palm was calloused, warm despite the blood loss. "Why do you care what happens to me?" he asked. Margaret looked down at him. This proud, wounded man who lived apart from everyone, who gave gifts in secret and endured hatred in silence. "Because," she said slowly, "I think we're looking for the same answers. And because—" She paused, then spoke the truth. "Because you remind me that I'm not the only one carrying ghosts." He released her wrist, but his dark eyes held hers for a long moment. Then he nodded that slight dip of his head that had become their language. As she turned to go, he spoke again, so quietly she almost missed it. "Coda," he said. "My name, not the Apache." "Margaret," she replied without turning. "Not Miss." She left him there, knowing she'd crossed some invisible line. The town already suspected her of sympathizing with him. Now, she realized, she'd moved beyond sympathy into something more dangerous alliance. But as she cleaned the blood from her hands in her small room, she thought of the missing women, of the codes in her journal, of the wound that someone had given him for getting too close to something. Tomorrow, she decided, she would show him what she'd found in the dead officer's papers. It was time to stop searching alone. The rain came 3 nights later, turning the streets of Red Hollow into rivers of mud and forcing everyone indoors. Margaret sat by her small window. The lamp turned low. Her journal spread open on the narrow desk she'd fashioned from a crate. The coded messages seemed to mock her with their secrets. Symbols and numbers that almost made sense, but slipped away when she tried to grasp their meaning. Outside, lightning illuminated the yard in brief. Stark flashes. She could see Coda's cabin, dark except for the faint glow of a fire through the window. He was healing well. She'd checked his wound that morning despite his protests, finding no sign of infection. But something had changed between them since that night. The careful distance they'd maintained had dissolved, replaced by something more complex. Thunder rolled across the sky, and with it came a memory she'd tried to bury another storm, another night, finding Captain Morrison's body in his tent, his throat cut, papers scattered across his desk. She'd known even then that his death wasn't random. He'd been investigating irregularities in supply shipments, had confided in her his suspicions about diverted cargo. In the chaos after his murder, she'd managed to copy some of his documents before they disappeared. Now, months later and half a continent away, she stared at those same cryptic notations, references to special cargo and seer as requirements. Coordinates that, when she'd finally matched them to maps, led here to Red Hollow and the surrounding territory. A soft knock at her door made her start. She closed the journal quickly, hiding it beneath her shawl. "Yes, it is me," Coda's voice, low and careful. She opened the door to find him standing in the rain, water streaming from his hair, a blanket wrapped around his shoulders. Even in the darkness, she could see the tension in his stance. "What's wrong?" she asked, stepping aside to let him in. He entered, bringing the smell of rain and pine. In the small space, he seemed even larger, more dangerous. Water pooled around his boots as he stood there, clearly uncomfortable but determined. "The storm," he said finally. "It reminds you of something." Margaret blinked. "How could you possibly?" "Your lamp. It moves when you are restless, back and forth, like you pace without walking." He paused. "I know this because I do the same." She should have been unnerved by his observation, but instead found herself almost smiling. "And what does the storm remind you of?" "The night they took her, my sister, also rain, also thunder." His jaw tightened. "I was hunting, came back to find the camp empty. Signs of struggle. Followed the trail for days until it disappeared at a trading post. The man there, he knew something but would not speak." "What was his name?" Margaret asked, though she suspected she already knew. "Clayton Rigg." The name hung between them like a physical presence. Margaret moved to her hiding place, retrieving the journal. Coda watched without comment as she opened it, revealing pages of coded messages and copied documents. "I found these after my superior was murdered," she said quietly. "He was investigating diverted military supplies. Someone was stealing from the army, selling to someone else. The trail led here." Coda moved closer, studying the pages. His English might be accented, but she realized his understanding was perfect as his finger traced the patterns. "This symbol," he said, pointing to a mark that appeared repeatedly. "I have seen it." "Where?" "Burned into crates that move through town at night, always covered, always guarded." His dark eyes met hers. Always young women's voices inside. Margaret's blood chilled. "You're certain?" "I followed once. They went to Rigg's warehouse at the edge of town. But there are too many guards. Too many guns for one man." "Then perhaps it's time to stop being one man," Margaret said. He studied her for a long moment. "You would risk this, you have no obligation." "I became obligated the moment I put on a nurse's apron." She interrupted. "I swore to help those who couldn't help themselves. That oath didn't end with the war. And if we are caught, you know what they do to women who—" "I know exactly what they do," Margaret said flatly. "I've seen it, which is why we won't get caught." Lightning flashed again, illuminating his face, for the first time since she'd met him. She saw something like surprise in his expression. "You are not what I expected," he said. "Neither are you." They spent the next hour going through her notes together, Coda adding his own observations. He'd been tracking the shipments for months, had identified patterns. Always during the new moon, when darkness was complete. Always from the east, heading west after a stop in Red Hollow. "There's another shipment due," Margaret said, checking the calendar. 4 nights from now. "Yes, but this time is different. Rigg has hired more men, brought in gunfighters from Tucson." Coda's expression darkened. "Something big is coming." "Or someone important is coming to inspect the operation," Margaret suggested. "The messages mention someone coming to review the merchandise." "Then we must act before—" A sound outside made them both freeze. Footsteps in the mud, trying to be quiet but failing. Coda moved with liquid grace, pressing against the wall beside the door. Margaret blew out the lamp, plunging them into darkness. The footsteps stopped just outside. A board creaked on the small porch. Then, slowly, the door handle began to turn. Margaret had locked it, but locks in Red Hollow were more suggestion than barrier. The handle jiggled. Then came the sound of metal on metal. Someone working the lock. Coda's hand found hers in the darkness, pressed something cold and hard into her palm. A knife. She gripped it, remembering desperate moments in field hospitals when Confederate raiders had broken through the lines. The lock clicked open. The door swung inward, and a figure stepped through, silhouetted against the storm. Lightning flashed, revealing Tom Garrett's face, twisted with drink and intention. Well, he slurred, not yet seeing Coda in the shadows. Thought you'd be alone on a night like this. Came to keep you company. Get out, Margaret said coldly. He laughed, shutting the door behind him. Now that's not friendly. Not after you hit me. You owe me an apology. Maybe more than an apology. He stepped forward, and Coda moved. It happened so fast Margaret almost missed it. One moment Garrett was advancing. The next, he was on the floor. Coda's knee in his back, a blade at his throat. The lady said leave, Coda said, his voice deadly quiet. Garrett's eyes bulged with fear and rage. Get off me, you savage! I'll see you hanged. You will see nothing if you do not leave now. Coda pressed the blade closer, drawing a thin line of blood. And if you speak of this, if you come near her again, I will find you. Understand? Garrett nodded frantically. Coda released him, hauling him to his feet and shoving him toward the door. The man stumbled out into the storm, casting one terrified look back before disappearing into the night. Coda closed and barred the door, then turned to Margaret. In the darkness, she could barely see him, but she could feel the violence still radiating from him. He will make trouble, Coda said. He already has, Margaret replied. She lit the lamp again, her hands steady despite the adrenaline coursing through her. But now he'll be more careful about it. You should not stay here. It is not safe. Nowhere is safe. At least here I know where the danger comes from. He moved closer, and she could see the conflict in his face. I cannot protect you all the time. I'm not asking you to protect me at all, Margaret said firmly. I'm asking you to work with me. There's a difference. You do not understand. If they connect you to me, if they think you are helping, they already think that. They've thought it since I stopped them from beating you. She met his gaze squarely. I made my choice that night. I'm not changing it now. Something shifted in his expression, a softening, perhaps, or maybe just resignation. You are stubborn. So are you. Despite everything, he almost smiled. It transformed his face, giving her a glimpse of who he might have been before loss and violence shaped him into this wary, dangerous man. My sister was stubborn too, he said quietly. Always arguing, always pushing boundaries. My mother said she would either become a great leader or get us all killed. What was her name? Ayana. It means eternal bloom. His voice caught slightly. She was 15 when they took her. Margaret's heart clenched. 15. Just a child? We'll find her, she said, and meant it. He looked at her for a long moment, then nodded slowly. Together, then. Together. They returned to the journal, planning in low voices as the storm raged outside. Margaret showed him more of the coded messages, and he helped her understand patterns she'd missed. They would need more information, he said. Maps of Riggs' warehouse, guard schedules, routes in and out. I can get into places without being seen, he said, but I need someone who can move freely in town, ask questions without suspicion. Leave that to me. A concerned woman asking about missing girls raises fewer alarms than a man skulking in shadows. It is still dangerous. Everything worth doing is, as the storm began to fade. Coda prepared to leave. At the door, he paused, looking back at her. Why did you really come west? He asked. It was not just about the missing women. Margaret considered lying, but found she couldn't. Not to him. I came because I couldn't stand the pretense anymore. People calling me a hero for saving lives while ignoring the corruption that sent those boys to die. I came because I found evidence of that corruption and no one would listen. I came because—" She paused, searching for words. "Because I needed to believe that somewhere. Justice still mattered. And if there is no justice, only vengeance." "Then I'll take that too," she said quietly. He studied her face, then reached into his shirt, pulling out a small leather pouch on a cord. He removed it, holding it out to her. "This was Ayana's," he said, "for protection. You should not be without it." Margaret took the pouch, feeling something small and hard inside. The leather was soft with age, decorated with beadwork she could barely see in the lamplight. "I can't—" "You will," he said firmly. "Until we find her. Then you return it to her yourself." Before she could respond, he was gone, disappearing into the dying storm. Margaret stood in her doorway, the pouch warm in her hand, watching the darkness where he'd vanished. The rain had washed the air clean, and she could smell sage and pine on the wind. Somewhere in this rough frontier town, young women were being held against their will, shipped like cargo to unknown fates. Somewhere, a 15-year-old girl named Ayana might still be alive, waiting for rescue. And somewhere in the shadows between Margaret's world and Coda's, an alliance was forming that would either save them all or destroy them. She closed the door and returned to her journal, adding new notes in her precise hand. 4 nights until the next shipment. 4 nights to prepare. The storm was over, but Margaret had a feeling the real tempest was just beginning. The morning mist clung to the ground like a shroud as Margaret made her way along the forest path. She'd told Martha she needed herbs for cooking, not entirely a lie, though her real purpose lay deeper in the woods. The small puppy she'd found whimpering in a tangle of thorns was tucked inside her shawl, its breathing labored and thin. She'd discovered it at dawn while gathering water, its hind leg twisted at an ugly angle, fur matted with blood. Any sensible person would have left it. Frontier life had no room for sentiment over wounded animals. But something in its desperate eyes had stopped her, perhaps recognizing a fellow creature fighting to survive. The clearing where she'd agreed to meet Coda was empty, but she knew he was near. She'd learned to sense his presence the way she'd learned to sense incoming artillery, a shift in the air, a quality of stillness that spoke of careful watching. "I know you're there," she called softly, kneeling to examine the puppy's injuries more closely. He emerged from the trees like smoke becoming solid, his expression unreadable as always. His eyes went immediately to the bundle in her arms. "It's hurt," Margaret said unnecessarily. "Found it caught in thorns. The leg is broken, and there are deep cuts." "It will die," Coda interrupted, his voice flat. "Better to end it quickly." "That's what they said about half the soldiers I treated," Margaret replied, not looking up. "I didn't listen then either." She heard him move closer, felt him crouch beside her. The puppy whimpered, trying to shrink away from this new presence. "Let me see," he said after a moment. His hands were surprisingly gentle as he examined the animal, fingers probing the injuries with practiced care. The puppy stopped struggling, seeming to sense that despite his harsh words, this man meant no harm. "The bone is not broken," he said finally. "Displaced. It can be set." He looked at her, something almost like amusement in his dark eyes. "You cannot heal every wounded thing you find." "I can try," Margaret said simply. He made a sound that might have been a laugh, soft and brief. Then, without asking, he began to work on the puppy's leg. His movements were sure and skilled, realigning the joint with a quick motion that made the animal yelp once, then settle. "Hold him," Coda instructed, producing strips of leather from somewhere to bind the leg. "My people say all creatures choose their fate. This one has chosen to fight. We must honor that choice." As he worked, Margaret studied him, in daylight, without the barrier of walls between them. He seemed both more human and more foreign. Scars marked his hands and arms, each one a story of survival. His hair, tied back with a leather cord, showed hints of early gray despite his relative youth. "You've done this before," she observed. "Many times. Animals do not judge by the color of skin or the language spoken. They see only helper or threat." He secured the final binding, then sat back. "There is moss that helps wounds heal. I will show you." They spent the next hour in the forest, Coda teaching her which plants had healing properties, which bark could ease pain when boiled into tea. The puppy, exhausted by its ordeal, slept in her arms as they walked. It was the most peace she'd felt since arriving in Red Hollow. But peace was fragile on the frontier, and theirs shattered with the sound of approaching horses. Coda heard them first, his hand going to her arm in warning. They crouched behind a fallen log, Margaret clutching the puppy to keep it quiet. Through the trees, she could see riders, 4 men, heavily armed, faces she didn't recognize. "New guns," Coda breathed in her ear. "From Tucson, Riggs' men." They were following the path Margaret had taken, one man dismounting to study the ground. "Tracks," he called to the others. "Woman's boots, heading into the woods." That would be the nurse. Another replied. "The one that's been asking questions. Boss wants to know what she's up to." Margaret's heart hammered against her ribs. She'd been careful in her inquiries about missing girls, but apparently not careful enough. "She's got to be close," the tracker said, following her trail. "These are fresh." Coda's hand moved to his knife, against 4 armed men. It would be a slaughter, but she could see in his stance that he would fight rather than let them take her. Then the puppy stirred in her arms, letting out a small whine. The tracker's head snapped up. "You hear that?" "Could be anything," another man said nervously. These plainsmen might be dangerous, but the deep forest still held mysteries that made them uneasy. "Lots of animals out here." It didn't sound like no wild animal. They were moving closer, hands on their weapons. In moments, they would see them. Margaret made a decision. She pressed the puppy into Coda's surprised hands, then stood up before he could stop her. "Gentlemen," she called out, stepping into view. "Are you lost?" The men startled, guns half drawn before they recognized her. The tracker scowled. "Miss Doyle, what are you doing out here alone?" "Gathering herbs," she said, showing the plants in her basket. "Martha's rheumatism acts up in the damp weather. I promised to make her a poultice." She smiled pleasantly. "Though I must say, you gave me quite a fright. 4 armed men is rather excessive for herb gathering, don't you think?" "Mr. Rigg wants to make sure you stay safe," the tracker said, his tone making it clear that her safety was the last thing on Rigg's mind. "Dangerous country for a woman alone." "How thoughtful. Please thank Mr. Rigg for his concern. Now, if you'll excuse me, I should return before Martha worries." She turned to go, but one of the men moved his horse to block her path. "Maybe we should escort you back. Make sure you get there safe." "That won't be necessary. Wasn't really asking, Miss." The threat hung in the air between them. Margaret's mind raced through possibilities, none of them good. Then, from somewhere in the trees, came a sound that made all the horses rear nervously, the deep, rumbling growl of a mountain cat. The men cursed, fighting to control their mounts. The growl came again, closer this time, and one of the horses bolted entirely. "To hell with this," one man said. "Let's get out of here." The tracker looked like he wanted to argue, but another growl so close it seemed to come from directly above them decided the matter. They wheeled their horses and galloped back toward town, leaving Margaret standing alone on the path. Or apparently alone. Coda emerged from the trees, the puppy cradled in one arm. "That was you," Margaret said. It wasn't a question. "Mountain cats hunt at night, not morning," he confirmed, "but city men do not know this." "Thank you. You should not have shown yourself. Now they know you were here." "They already knew. Better to control when and how they see me than to be caught hiding. She reached for the puppy, which licked her hand weakly. We need to be more careful. Rig is getting suspicious. Then we must act soon. Coda's expression was grim. Tonight, I will scout the warehouse, learn the new guard positions. I'm coming with you. No, it is too dangerous. Everything is dangerous now, Margaret interrupted. I'm already a target. At least together we can watch each other's backs. He looked like he wanted to argue further, but something in her face stopped him. You are the most stubborn woman I have known. I'll take that as a compliment. They made their way back toward town separately, Coda disappearing into the forest while Margaret took the open path. The puppy had fallen asleep again, trusting despite its pain. She envied its ability to rest. As she emerged from the tree line, she saw Martha standing behind the restaurant, arms crossed, worry etched on her weathered face. Those men, Martha said without preamble. They came looking for you. I know. I met them in the woods. Martha's eyes sharpened. And they were very concerned for my safety, Margaret said dryly. This isn't a joke. Girl, Tom Garrett's been spreading poison about you all over town. Says you're consorting with that Apache. Says you're both up to something. Rig's been listening. Let them talk. Talk can get you killed out here just as sure as a bullet. Martha noticed the bundle in Margaret's arms for the first time. What's that? A patient, Margaret said, showing her the sleeping puppy. He needs care. Martha shook her head but didn't object. Bring it inside, but keep it quiet. Last thing we need is customers complaining about animals in the kitchen. That evening, as Margaret tended the puppy in a box by the stove, she heard familiar footsteps outside. A moment later, Coda's shadow passed her window. On the sill, he'd left something, a small bundle of moss and herbs, along with a carved wooden whistle no bigger than her thumb. She understood the message. The moss was for the puppy's wounds. The whistle was for her, a way to call for help if needed. She picked it up, noting the intricate patterns carved into its surface. Such careful work for something so small. She wondered when he'd made it, if he'd been thinking of her safety as his knife shaped the wood. The door to the main dining room swung open, interrupting her thoughts. Tom Garrett stood there, his jaw still showing the bruise from her coffee pot, but now he wore a deputy star on his vest. Well, well, he drawled. Seems I've got myself a new job. Sheriff Patterson thought I'd make a fine lawman. Means I'll be keeping a close eye on things around here. Real close. Margaret kept her expression neutral. Congratulations, Deputy Garrett. Now, the dining room is closed. Oh, I'm not here to eat. He moved closer, and she could smell whiskey on his breath. I'm here in an official capacity. Had reports of suspicious activity. You wouldn't know anything about that, would you? I'm afraid you'll have to be more specific. Don't play games with me. You were seen in the woods today, meeting someone. Maybe. I was gathering herbs, alone, as I told your friends. His eyes narrowed. Funny thing about being alone. Sometimes people think they are when they're not. Sometimes people are watching real close. The threat was clear. Margaret's hand inched toward the knife she kept in her apron pocket, but she kept her voice calm. If you have an accusation to make, deputy, make it. Otherwise, please leave. As I said, we're closed. He stared at her for a long moment, then smiled unpleasantly. Oh, I'll be making accusations soon enough. You and your Indian friend, real soon. After he left, Margaret locked the door and leaned against it, heart racing. Time was running out. Whatever game Rig was playing, the stakes were rising. She looked at the puppy, now sleeping peacefully in its box. The herbs Coda had provided already seeming to help. Such a small thing, saving one injured creature. But sometimes, she thought, the small acts of kindness were what kept you human in an inhuman world. Tomorrow night, she and Coda would scout the warehouse. Whatever they found there would likely determine all their fates. She fingered the wooden whistle, then slipped it into her pocket next to Ayana's medicine pouch. 2 gifts from a man who claimed to trust no one, yet had trusted her with his sister's memory and her safety both. Through the wall, she heard movement in his cabin. Was he preparing for tomorrow night? Was he thinking of her the way she found herself thinking of him at odd moments throughout the day? The puppy stirred, whimpering softly. She knelt beside it, gently stroking its head until it settled. In the morning, she would need to check its bindings, apply more of Coda's moss. Such simple tasks, caring for wounded things. She'd built a life on such tasks. But tomorrow night would be different. Tomorrow night, she would step fully into the darkness that had been calling to her since she'd found those coded papers. Tomorrow night, she would stop being a healer and become something else entirely. The thought should have frightened her. Instead, she felt only a cold certainty. Justice or vengeance? Coda had asked, looking at the sleeping puppy, thinking of Ayana and all the other lost girls. Margaret knew her answer. She would take whatever she could get. The exchange of gifts had become their unspoken language. Margaret would find things at her door in the early morning. A rabbit one day, wild turkey the next, always cleaned and prepared with meticulous care. Once, she discovered a small leather pouch containing dried berries she'd never seen before, sweet and tart on her tongue. In return, she left her own offerings on the step of his cabin when she knew he was away. Fresh bread still warm from the oven, wrapped in clean cloth. A jar of apple preserves Martha had taught her to make. A new shirt she'd sewn from sturdy cotton, guessing at his measurements. She never saw him wear it, but it disappeared from his doorstep, and that was acknowledgement enough. The puppy, which she'd named Scout for his curious nature despite his injured leg, had become an unexpected bridge between them. Coda would appear at odd moments to check the healing progress, his hands gentle as he examined the bindings. During one such visit, Scout had licked his face enthusiastically, and Margaret had seen Coda smile a real smile that transformed his stern features into something almost boyish. "He knows you saved him," Margaret said, watching from her doorway. "We saved him," Coda corrected, then seemed surprised by his own words. It was a week after the incident in the forest when the first real trouble came. Margaret was serving the lunch crowd when she noticed several miners whispering urgently, their eyes darting to the door. Tom Garrett sat in the corner, his new deputy's badge catching the light, watching her with undisguised malice. "Heard there was some excitement last night," one miner said loudly enough for all to hear. "Someone tried to break into Riggs' warehouse. Guards shot him dead." Margaret's hand stilled on the coffee pot, but she kept her expression neutral. "Yeah," another added. "Indian. They said, probably trying to steal." Her heart hammered, but she forced herself to continue pouring coffee. Coda had gone to Scout last night, but he'd promised to be careful. He had to be alive. He had to be. "Course, they can't find the body," the first miner continued. "Trail of blood leading into the forest, but then nothing, like he just vanished." "Or someone helped him vanish," Garrett said, his eyes fixed on Margaret. She met his gaze steadily. "More coffee, deputy." The afternoon dragged endlessly. Margaret went through the motions of her work, but her mind was in the forest, following that trail of blood. As soon as the last customer left, she grabbed her medical bag and the scraps she'd saved for Scout. "I'm taking the dog for a walk," she told Martha. The older woman looked at her sharply. "A walk in the forest as night's coming on." "Scout needs exercise. His leg is healing well." Martha sighed. "Take the shotgun. And girl, be careful. Whatever you're really doing, be careful." Margaret found him by the creek, just as she'd known she would. It was their unspoken meeting place, far enough from town to avoid watchers. He sat propped against a boulder, his shirt dark with blood, trying to clean a wound on his shoulder. "You're doing it wrong again," she said, setting Scout down. The puppy immediately limped over to Coda, tail wagging. He looked up, and she saw exhaustion beneath his stoic mask. "It is nothing. Nothing doesn't bleed that much." She was already kneeling beside him, pushing his hands away to examine the wound. A bullet had grazed his shoulder, leaving a deep furrow. "What happened?" "More guards than expected, and they were ready. Someone warned them." Margaret cleaned the wound with practiced efficiency, trying not to think about how close the bullet had come to hitting something vital. "What did you see?" "Enough." His jaw tightened as she began stitching. "The warehouse has been modified. New locks, reinforced doors, and inside cells, like they're holding prisoners, not storing goods." "How many?" "Could not see clearly, but I heard them. Young voices, crying." Margaret's hands paused for just a moment before continuing. "We have to get them out." "We need help. 2 people against Riggs' men, it would be suicide." "Then we find help." "Who?" "The sheriff takes Riggs' money. The townsfolk are afraid. And I am—" He gestured to himself with his good arm. "I am what they fear most." Margaret tied off the last stitch and sat back on her heels. Scout had curled up against Coda's leg, as trusting as if he'd known him all his short life. "There might be another way," she said slowly. "The coded messages mention someone coming to inspect the merchandise, someone important enough that Rigg is hiring extra guards. If we could intercept them, get evidence." "Or we could wait until they're all in one place," Coda said, understanding immediately. During the inspection, they would be focused on impressing their visitor, not watching for trouble. "It's still dangerous." "Everything worth doing is," he said, echoing her own words back to her. In the fading light, she could see something in his eyes that made her breath catch not quite softness, but a recognition, an acknowledgement of what was growing between them. "You should go," he said after a moment. "They will be watching for you to leave town." "You can't stay here. That wound needs proper care, and you need rest." "I have sheltered here before. Not with a bullet wound." She made a decision. "There's an old trapper's cabin about a mile north, been abandoned for years. We'll go there." He looked like he wanted to argue, but Scout chose that moment to lick his hand, whimpering softly. Something in the small creature's trust seemed to decide him. "Help me up," he said quietly. The walk to the cabin was slow, Coda leaning on her more than he would probably admit. Scout limped along beside them, occasionally running ahead as if scouting the path. The cabin, when they reached it, was little more than 4 walls and a roof, but it was shelter. Margaret built a small fire while Coda rested. She'd brought supplies in her bag bandages, a flask of whiskey for cleaning wounds, some dried meat and hardtack. As she worked, she was aware of him watching her. "You've done this before," he observed. "Hidden wounded men. Too many times." She checked his bandage, satisfied the bleeding had stopped, though usually they were wearing Union blue. And if they had worn gray? She considered the question. "I would have helped them anyway. A wound doesn't care about the color of your uniform, or the color of your skin, or that." They sat in companionable silence as darkness fell. Scout curled between them, his small body warm against the cooling air. Finally, Coda spoke. "My sister would have liked you. She also believed in helping without conditions. Tell me about her." He was quiet for so long she thought he wouldn't answer. Then, staring into the fire, he began to speak. "She was born during the winter of the falling stars. My mother said it was a sign that she would burn bright but briefly. She laughed at that, said she would burn bright and long, like the sun." His voice grew softer as he spoke of teaching her to track, of her stubborn insistence on learning warrior skills alongside women's work, of her gift with horses and her dream of seeing the great cities she'd heard traders speak of. "The last time I saw her, she was angry with me. I had forbidden her from going to the trading post. Too many strange men. I said, too much danger. She said I was trying to cage her like a bird." He paused. She was right. You were trying to protect her. And failed. The word hung heavy between them. When I returned from hunting, the camp was destroyed. They had taken her and 2 other girls. I tracked them for days. But they had horses, wagons. The trail led here and went cold. Margaret reached out without thinking, her hand covering his. He went still at the touch, but didn't pull away. We'll find her, she said. The shipment in 3 nights, that's our chance. He turned his hand palm up, fingers intertwining with hers. Why do you care so much? This is not your fight. Every fight against injustice is my fight, she said, and... She hesitated, then spoke the truth. And you've become important to me. Your fight has become mine. In the firelight, his dark eyes were unreadable. Then, slowly, he lifted their joined hands and pressed his lips to her knuckles, a gesture so unexpected and gentle that her heart stumbled. You are dangerous, Margaret Doyle, he said quietly. You make me hope, and hope is the most dangerous thing of all. Then be dangerous with me, she whispered. He drew her closer, and she went willingly, careful of his wounded shoulder. His other arm came around her, and for a moment they simply held each other, 2 damaged souls finding solace in shared warmth. Scout whimpered in his sleep, chasing dream rabbits, and the spell broke. But something had shifted between them, some last barrier fallen. I should check your shoulder again, Margaret said, not quite meeting his eyes. It can wait. He touched her face gently, thumb tracing her cheekbone. Stay, just for a while. So she stayed, sitting beside him as the fire burned low, their hands linked like a promise. Tomorrow would bring new dangers, new challenges. But tonight, in this crude shelter with a wounded dog at their feet and the warmth of connection between them, they had found something worth fighting for, beyond justice or vengeance. They had found each other. When Margaret finally returned to town near midnight, she was surprised to find Martha waiting up, a lamp burning in the kitchen. He's alive then, the older woman said without preamble. Margaret started to deny it, then simply nodded. Martha poured 2 cups of tea, pushing one across to Margaret. I knew his sister, Ayanna, bright girl, used to come to the trading post with the most beautiful beadwork. She paused. I was there the day they took her. Margaret's cup stopped halfway to her lips. What? Riggs men said they were arresting her for theft. Lies, of course. But what could anyone do by the time word reached her brother? They were long gone. Why didn't you tell anyone? Tell who? Sheriff Patterson. He signed the arrest order. The mayor, he owes Rigg money. Martha's face was bitter. This town is rotten to its core. Girl, has been for years. Then help us change it. Martha studied her for a long moment. What are you planning? Margaret made a decision. She told Martha everything, the coded messages, the warehouse, the shipment coming in 3 nights. Martha listened without interrupting, her weathered face growing grimmer with each word. You'll need more than just the 2 of you, Martha said finally. I may know some people, families who've lost daughters. They've been afraid to speak up, but if they knew there was real hope, would they help? Maybe, if they believed it could work. Martha stood, suddenly looking older than her years. I'll make some quiet inquiries. But girl, if this goes wrong, we'll all hang, or worse. I know. Martha nodded slowly. Then God help us all. As Margaret climbed the stairs to her room, Scout limping faithfully behind. She thought of Coda alone in that cabin, wounded but not broken, of Ayanna and all the lost girls, of justice denied and hope kindled. 3 nights. 3 nights to prepare for a confrontation that would either free the innocent or destroy them all. She touched the wooden whistle in her pocket. Then Ayanna's medicine pouch, talismans of trust from a man who had every reason to trust no one. Through her window, she could see stars scattered across the prairie sky like spilled diamonds. Somewhere under those same stars, young women waited in chains for rescue, and somewhere, A warrior's heart was learning to hope again. Margaret Doyle had come west seeking a new life. What she'd found was a purpose worth dying for and a man worth living for. Now she just had to survive long enough to claim both. The moon hung like a silver coin in the cloudless sky as Margaret made her way through the shadows at the edge of town. 3 nights had passed since she'd tended Coda's wound in the abandoned cabin. 3 nights of careful preparation. Martha had been true to her word, quietly reaching out to families who'd lost daughters, gauging their willingness to act. The response had been mixed, fear still outweighing hope for most. But tonight was the night. The coded messages had been clear a special shipment would arrive, and someone important would be there to inspect it. Their best chance, perhaps their only chance. She found Coda waiting at their designated meeting spot, a cluster of rocks overlooking Riggs' warehouse. In the darkness, he was nearly invisible. Having traded his usual clothing for all black, his shoulder had healed well, she noted with a professional eye, though he still favored it slightly. "You're late," he said softly as she crouched beside him. "Tom Garrett was watching my door. I had to go through Martha's root cellar to get out unseen." She pulled out the small spyglass she'd borrowed from Martha, a relic from her late husband's military service. "What have you observed?" "More guards than usual. 8 outside, probably more inside. And," he pointed to a covered wagon near the warehouse entrance, "that arrived an hour ago. Heavy, by the way the wheels sit. And I heard voices from inside, young voices." Margaret's jaw tightened. More girls, brought in for the inspection like cattle to market. The thought made her sick. "There," Coda whispered, touching her arm. "Someone comes." A fine carriage rolled into view, incongruous in the rough frontier setting. It stopped before the warehouse, and a man emerged well-dressed, carrying himself with the arrogance of wealth and power, even from their distance. Margaret could see the way the guards straightened, the deference in their postures. That must be the buyer, she breathed. The one the messages called CR's most valued client. They watched as Clayton Rigg himself emerged from the warehouse, greeting the man with elaborate courtesy. The two disappeared inside, leaving the guards to their posts. "Now we wait," Coda said. "When they are occupied with their business." A hand fell on Margaret's shoulder, and she nearly cried out before recognizing Martha's weathered face in the moonlight. "Brought help," the older woman whispered. Behind her stood 2 men Margaret recognized: Samuel Morrison, whose daughter had vanished 6 months ago, and James Chen, who ran the laundry and whose niece had disappeared just last month. Both carried rifles. "There's more coming," Martha continued. "But they're waiting to see if this is real, if we can prove what's in that warehouse." "Then we move now," Coda decided, before they finish their inspection and leave. They made their way down the hillside, using every shadow, every bit of cover. Margaret's heart pounded so hard she was certain the guards would hear it. But Coda moved like smoke, and the others followed his lead. They were within 50 yards of the warehouse when everything went wrong. A guard, stepping out to relieve himself, spotted them. His shout of alarm split the night, and suddenly the air was full of gunfire. "Move!" Coda shouted, breaking into a run. Margaret ran, the medical bag banging against her hip. A bullet whined past her ear. She saw Samuel Morrison stumble and fall, clutching his leg. Without thinking, she veered toward him. "Go!" he gasped. "Get them girls out!" She hesitated only a moment before running on. The warehouse doors were opening, more guards spilling out, but Coda was already among them, moving with lethal grace. His knife flashed in the moonlight, and men fell. Margaret reached the wagon, yanking open the canvas cover. Inside, huddled in chains, were 6 girls. The youngest couldn't have been more than 14. Their eyes were wide with terror. "We're here to help," Margaret said urgently, pulling out the bolt cutters Martha had procured. "Stay quiet and follow me when you're free." Her hands shook as she cut through the chains. Behind her, The battle raged. She could hear James Chen's rifle firing steadily, Martha's shotgun booming, and through it all, Coda's war cry, a sound that raised the hair on her arms and sent guards scattering. Maggie! One of the girls gasped her name, and Margaret nearly dropped the cutters. It was Jenny Patterson, the sheriff's own daughter, who'd supposedly run off to San Francisco 3 months ago. Jenny, your father. He sold me, the girl said bitterly. His debts to Rig. Sold his own daughter. Margaret's world tilted. The sheriff was in on it. Of course he was. The corruption ran even deeper than she'd imagined. She got the last chain cut just as Coda appeared at the wagon. Can they run? He asked, blood on his face that wasn't his own. They'll have to. Then go, into the forest. Martha knows where. His words were cut off by a gunshot. Not the wild firing of the battle, but a deliberate, close-range shot. Coda spun and fell, red blooming across his shirt. No! Margaret caught him as he collapsed, her hands immediately going to the wound. Chest, right side. Bad, but maybe not fatal if she could stop the bleeding. Tom Garrett stood there, smoking pistol in hand, his deputy's badge gleaming. Got you now, Indian, and your woman too. Margaret didn't think. The derringer she'd hidden in her medical bag, a last resort she'd hoped never to use, was in her hand and firing before Garrett could react. He looked surprised as he fell, hand clutching his throat. Get him up, Martha appeared, James Chen limping beside her. Together they hauled Coda to his feet. The girls from the wagon scattered into the night as planned, Jenny Patterson pausing only to spit on Garrett's writhing form. They made it to the tree line before the remaining guards regrouped. Margaret could hear Riggs shouting orders, promising rewards for their capture. But they were in Coda's element now, the forest that he knew like his own breath. Despite his wound, he led them unerringly through the darkness to a cave system he'd scouted days before. Only when they were deep inside, hidden from any pursuit, did he allow himself to collapse. Margaret worked by lamplight, her hands steady despite the tears streaming down her face. The bullet had missed his lung by inches. She could save him. She had to save him. The girls, he whispered as she worked. Safe. Martha had families waiting to hide them. She didn't mention Jenny Patterson. Not yet. That revelation could wait. The buyer. Escaped in his carriage when the fighting started. But we have witnesses now. Girls who can testify. If they live long enough to testify, James Chen said grimly. Rig owns this town. Then we go over his head, Martha said. I know a federal marshal in Denver. Honest man, if we can get word to him. I'll go, Samuel Morrison said from where he sat with his own wound bandaged. Right out at dawn. Rig won't expect an injured man to run. Margaret finished her work and sat back, exhausted. Coda's breathing was easier now. The immediate danger passed, but he would need time to heal, and time was something they might not have. As if reading her thoughts, his hand found hers. You saved them, he said softly. 6 girls free because of you. Because of us, she corrected. All of us. My sister, was she among them? Margaret's heart broke at the hope in his voice. No, I'm sorry. He closed his eyes. Then we are not finished. No, she agreed. We're not. Dawn was breaking by the time they'd made plans. Samuel would ride for Denver. Martha would shelter the freed girls with trusted families outside town. James Chen would spread word quietly among the Chinese community, many of whom had also lost daughters. And Margaret would return to town, brazen it out, claim she'd been tending a sick farmer all night. They'll know, Coda said when she told him the plan. Garrett saw you. Garrett's dead, she said flatly, and I was never there. Let them prove otherwise. He studied her face, this woman who'd killed to save him. You've changed, he said. We all change, Margaret replied. The lucky ones get to choose how. She left him in Martha's capable hands and made her way back to town as the sun painted the sky pink and gold. The warehouse area was swarming with activity, but no one stopped her as she walked calmly to the restaurant. Inside, she washed Garrett's blood from her hands and began preparing for the breakfast crowd as if nothing had happened. Her hands were steady as she mixed biscuit dough, but her mind was racing. They'd struck the first blow, but the war was far from over. Rig would retaliate. The freed girls were witnesses, but only if they could be kept safe long enough to testify. And somewhere out there, Ayanna and others were still captive. The breakfast crowd was thinner than usual, men talking in hushed voices about the night's events. Different stories circulated: Indians attacking, bandits after payroll, even talk of divine justice for unnamed sins. No one mentioned missing girls. It was nearly noon when Clayton Rigg himself walked through her door. He was a small man, compensating with expensive clothes and an air of menace. His pale eyes fixed on her as he settled at a corner table. "Coffee," he said, "and information." Margaret poured with a steady hand. "What kind of information?" "The kind about where you were last night and where your Indian friend might be hiding." "I was tending the Baxter family," she lied smoothly. "Their youngest has fever. As for Mr. Coda, I haven't seen him in days. We're not as friendly as gossip suggests." Funny, Tom Garrett seemed to think otherwise. Before he died, Deputy Garrett drank too much and thought many things, few of them true. Rigg studied her for a long moment. "You're a cool one, Miss Doyle, but cool won't save you if you're lying to me. Things are going to change in this town. Smart folks will know which side to be on." "I've always been on the side of keeping people fed and healthy," Margaret said. "Nothing more." "We'll see." He stood, leaving his coffee untouched. "Oh, and Miss Doyle, if any strangers come to you runaways, perhaps, or injured fugitives, you'd be wise to turn them away, or turn them in. There are rewards for information." After he left, Margaret's knees nearly buckled, but she forced herself to continue working, to smile at customers, to play the part of the innocent nurse concerned only with her duties. That night, as she lay in her narrow bed with a scout curled beside her, she thought of Coda wounded in that cave, of 6 girls tasting freedom, of a battle begun but far from won. Through her window, she could see men patrolling the streets, Rigg's men, armed and watchful. The town felt like a powder keg waiting for a spark. Tomorrow, Samuel Morrison would reach Denver if all went well. In a week, maybe 2, federal marshals might arrive. They just had to survive until then. She touched Ayanna's medicine pouch, drawing strength from it. Somewhere out there, a young woman waited for her brother to find her. Margaret swore silently that she would help reunite them, no matter the cost. The first blow had been struck. Now came the harder part, surviving the retaliation while building their case. But they had something Rigg hadn't counted on: people willing to risk everything for justice, and bonds forged in danger that were stronger than fear. The war for Red Hollow had begun. The rain came on the 4th night, washing the dust from Red Hollow's streets and providing cover for Margaret's journey to the cave. She moved carefully through the darkness, medical supplies hidden beneath her cloak, Scout limping faithfully beside her despite her attempts to leave him behind. She found Coda sitting up, his back against the cave wall, speaking quietly with Martha. In the lamplight, she could see the improvement in his color, though pain still etched lines around his eyes. "You shouldn't be here," he said as she entered, but his expression softened at the sight of her. "You shouldn't be sitting up," she countered, kneeling to check his bandages. "But we both seem to have trouble with shouldn't." Martha rose, gathering her things. "I'll keep watch outside. The patrols have been getting closer." When they were alone, Margaret worked in silence, cleaning and redressing the wound. His skin was warm under her hands, the muscle beneath testament to a life of physical hardship. She tried to keep her touch clinical, professional, but her fingers lingered perhaps a moment too long. "Any word from Morrison?" Coda asked. "Not yet, but it's only been 4 days. The road to Denver is long, especially for an injured man. And the girls?" Hidden. Safe for now. Jenny Patterson is with the Washburns. They lost their own daughter last year. She's prepared to testify about her father's involvement. Margaret paused in her work. There's something else. One of the other girls, Mary Clearwater, she's Cheyenne. She said she knew of you, that you helped her people before. Something flickered in his eyes. The Clearwater family? Yes, I guided them to safety when the army was forcing relocations. He was quiet for a moment. Is she well? Traumatized, but strong. She asked me to give you this. Margaret pulled out a small beaded bracelet. Said her grandmother would want you to have it for bringing her home. Coda took the bracelet with reverent hands, studying the intricate pattern. Her grandmother was a medicine woman. This is significant. Like Ayana's pouch. Similar protection, but also recognition. Among my mother's people, such gifts create bonds, obligations. He looked at her meaningfully. You understand this. I think you who came back to tend an enemy's wounds. You're not my enemy, Margaret said softly. No, he agreed. Not anymore. Their eyes met and held. The cave suddenly seemed very small, very warm. Margaret was acutely aware of how close they were, of the rise and fall of his chest, of the way the lamplight caught the angles of his face. Margaret, he began, then stopped, struggling with words. When Garrett shot me, when I was falling, my only thought was that I had not told you, had not said. She placed a finger gently on his lips. You don't have to say anything. But I do. He caught her hand, holding it against his chest where she could feel his heart beating strong and steady. You came into my life like dawn after endless night. I had forgotten there could be trust between people, forgotten that not all courage comes from anger. You reminded me. Coda! Let me finish. I may not have another chance. His voice was urgent now. If something happens to me, promise you'll keep looking for Ayana. Promise you won't let them win. Nothing is going to happen to you, Margaret said fiercely. We're going to find her together. We're going to stop Rig and free all those girls and... He silenced her with a kiss, gentle despite the passion she could feel coiled beneath it. For a moment, the world outside ceased to exist. There was only this, the warmth of his lips, the strength of his arms as they came around her, the feeling of coming home to a place she'd never known she was seeking. When they finally parted, both breathing unsteadily, he rested his forehead against hers. I should not have done that, he said, though he made no move to release her. Why not? Because now I have more to lose. Because caring for you makes me vulnerable in ways I cannot afford. Then we'll be vulnerable together. Margaret said, That's what partners do. A sound from outside made them spring apart Martha's warning whistle. Margaret quickly gathered her supplies as footsteps approached the cave entrance. But it wasn't Riggs' men who entered. It was James Chen, supporting a young Chinese woman Margaret didn't recognize. Found her on the road, Chen explained quickly. She escaped from a wagon heading west. Says there are more girls. Says she knows where they're taking them. The woman was exhausted, her clothes torn, feet bloody from running. But her eyes were fierce with determination as Margaret tended her injuries. My name is Liu Mei, she said in accented but clear English. I was taken from San Francisco 3 weeks ago. There are 12 of us in the wagon. They stop here to get supplies, then continue to the mining camps in the mountains. Which camps? Coda asked, leaning forward despite his injury. Silver Creek first, then others. They sell us to the mine owners to work in entertainment houses. She spat the words. But I listened. I heard them talking. There's a ledger. Rig keeps records of every girl, every transaction, names, dates, buyers. Margaret and Coda exchanged glances. A ledger would be evidence even corrupt local law couldn't ignore. Where? Margaret asked. In his office, behind the warehouse. I saw him writing in it when they brought us in. May grabbed Margaret's hand. Please, my sister is in that wagon. She's only 13. We'll get her, Margaret promised. We'll get them all. But even as she spoke, she knew the difficulties. Coda was still wounded. Their small group of allies was scattered, hiding, and now Riggs' men would be extra vigilant, knowing one girl had escaped. There's more, May said. The buyer who came to inspect us, I've seen him before, in San Francisco. He runs a network up and down the coast. Rig is just one piece. The implications were staggering. This wasn't just about Red Hollow. It was a whole system of evil, stretching across territories. All the more reason to get that ledger, Martha said grimly. Evidence of a network like that, the Federals would have to act. They spent the next hour planning. May sketched the layout of Riggs' office from memory. Chen would return to town, spread word among the Chinese community about May's sister and the others. Martha would check on the hidden girls, make sure they remained safe. And Margaret would return to her normal routine, maintaining her cover while gathering information. It's too dangerous, Coda protested when she prepared to leave. Rig already suspects you. He suspects everyone, but I'm still the helpful nurse who serves coffee and keeps her head down. Let me use that. She touched his face gently. Trust me, as I trust you. He caught her hand, pressing something into it, a small knife, barely longer than her finger but wickedly sharp. For protection, he said, since you insist on walking into danger. I'll be careful. You'll be more than careful. You'll be smart, and you'll come back. The last was said with such intensity that Margaret knew it for what it was. Not quite an order, not quite a plea, but something in between. I'll come back, she promised. The journey back to town seemed longer than usual. The rain had stopped, leaving the air fresh but the ground treacherous with mud. Scout struggled with his still-healing leg, and Margaret finally picked him up, carrying him the last quarter-mile. She slipped back into the restaurant through the root cellar, emerging into her room just as dawn was breaking. Barely an hour later, she was in the kitchen, preparing for the morning crowd as if she'd never left. The day brought unexpected news. Sheriff Patterson had disappeared in the night, leaving only a hastily scrawled resignation. The mayor had appointed a new interim sheriff, one of Riggs' men. Of course. But the suddenness of Patterson's departure caused whispers. Had he fled because his daughter could expose him, or had Rigg eliminated a liability? Margaret served coffee and collected gossip, filing away every useful piece of information. She learned that the wagon May had escaped from was delayed, sitting under heavy guard at the warehouse while they searched for her. The girls inside had been there for 2 days now, without proper food or water. That night, unable to bear the thought of those girls suffering, Margaret prepared a basket of food and water. She approached the warehouse openly, Scout at her heels. "What do you want?" one of the guards demanded. "Mr. Rigg hired me to check on his cargo," she said, putting distaste in her voice. "Make sure they're healthy enough to travel. Sick merchandise doesn't sell well." The guard looked uncertain. "He didn't tell us. Would you like to explain to Mr. Rigg why his property arrived in poor condition? Why he lost money because you wouldn't let a nurse do her job?" It was a gamble, but it worked. The guard reluctantly led her to the wagon. The condition inside made her stomach turn. 12 girls, aged 13 to perhaps 20, chained in a space meant for half that number. The smell of fear and despair was overwhelming. "I'm here to help," she said softly, distributing water and bread. She found May's sister, a delicate girl who looked even younger than her 13 years, and slipped her an extra portion along with a whispered message. "Your sister is safe. Hold on." As she worked, she memorized faces, counted heads, assessed their condition. 2 were ill, burning with fever. She convinced the guards to unchain them, insisting they needed medicine or Rigg would lose valuable property. "I'll take them to my room," she said. "Treat them there. They'll run. So, look at them. They can barely stand." She put steel in her voice. "Do you want to explain to Mr. Rig, how you let 2 of his investments die." Greed won over caution. They unchained the 2 sick girls, and Margaret half carried them back to the restaurant. Martha was waiting, having seen her approach. "Brave or foolish?" the older woman asked. "Both," Margaret admitted. "But I couldn't leave them." They settled the girls in the spare room, and Margaret began treating their fevers. They were Vietnamese, she learned, sisters taken from their family's fishing boat. They spoke little English, but their gratitude needed no translation. As she worked, Margaret thought of Coda in that cave, healing but impatient, of May hiding with her knowledge of the ledger, of Morrison somewhere on the road to Denver, of all the pieces moving in this dangerous game. Tomorrow night, she decided, while the guards were distracted with the delayed wagon, while Rig was focused on damage control, they would make their move for the ledger. She touched the small knife Coda had given her, hidden now in her bodice. Such a small thing, but weighted with meaning. A promise of protection, yes, but also of partnership, of trust between 2 people who had every reason to trust no one. Through her window, she could see guards patrolling, the warehouse lit up like a fortress. Somewhere in there was the evidence they needed, and somewhere beyond that, Ayanna and countless others waited for rescue. Margaret had come west to escape her past. Instead, she'd found a future worth fighting for, worth dying for, if necessary. But as she tucked the 2 rescued girls into bed, as Scout curled protectively at their feet, she amended that thought. Not worth dying for, worth living for, worth winning for. And with Coda beside her, she was beginning to believe they might actually win. The following night brought clouds that obscured the moon, perfect cover for what they planned. Margaret had spent the day maintaining her routine while finalizing preparations. The 2 Vietnamese sisters were hidden with the Washburns, adding to the growing number of witnesses against Rig. But witnesses meant nothing without hard evidence, the ledger that could expose the entire network. She met Coda at the designated spot, worry flooding through her at the sight of him. He moved stiffly, his wound clearly still paining him, but his eyes were sharp with determination. "You shouldn't be here," she said, knowing even as she spoke that nothing could have kept him away. "And you shouldn't be risking your life for people you've never met," he countered. Yet, here we are. Martha emerged from the shadows, followed by James Chen and 3 other men, fathers and brothers of missing girls. Liu Mei was there too, her face set with grim purpose. "The wagon is scheduled to leave at dawn," Mei reported. "They've doubled the guards since I escaped, but most are watching the wagon and the main warehouse. The office might be less protected." "Might be," one of the men muttered. "That's a thin hope to hang our lives on." "Then stay here," Coda said coldly. "No one forces you to act." The man bristled but didn't back down. "My daughter's been missing for 8 months. I'll take thin hope over no hope." Margaret intervened before tensions could rise further. "We all want the same thing. Let's focus on that." They moved through the darkness like ghosts, using the route Coda had scouted despite his injury. The warehouse complex loomed before them, lanterns creating pools of light they carefully avoided. Margaret could hear voices from the main building guards talking, laughing, unaware of the danger approaching. They split into 2 groups. Martha's group would create a distraction at the front, drawing guards away. Margaret, Coda, and May would slip into the office through a window May had identified. "Remember," Coda whispered as they crouched in the shadows. "If things go wrong, you run. Don't wait for me." "We've had this discussion," Margaret said firmly. "I don't abandon partners." Before he could argue, they heard Martha's group in action shouts, the crash of breaking crates, guards running to investigate. The office side of the building suddenly had only 1 guard, and he was peering toward the commotion. Coda moved like liquid shadow, and the guard crumpled soundlessly. They dragged him into the bushes. Then May jimmied the window with surprising skill. "My uncle was a locksmith," she explained at Margaret's raised eyebrow. He taught me things a proper lady shouldn't know. The office was dark, cluttered with papers and ledgers. They worked quickly, May holding a shielded lantern while Margaret and Coda searched. Minutes ticked by, each one feeling like an hour. "Here," Coda said suddenly, pulling a thick leather-bound book from a hidden compartment behind the desk. Even in the dim light, Margaret could see it was exactly what they needed: names, dates, transactions, all in Riggs' meticulous hand. "There's more," May whispered urgently, pointing to a stack of letters. "Correspondence with buyers." They grabbed everything they could carry, stuffing documents into the bag Margaret had brought. She was reaching for another ledger when she heard footsteps in the hallway outside. "Someone's coming," she hissed. They moved toward the window, but it was too late. The door burst open, and Clayton Riggs stood there, pistol in hand, 2 guards flanking him. "Well, well," Riggs said, his pale eyes glittering. "The nurse, the savage, and the runaway. How convenient." Coda stepped forward, shielding Margaret and May. "Let them go. Your issue is with me." Riggs laughed, an ugly sound. "My issue is with all of you. Did you really think I wouldn't expect this? I've been waiting. The distraction at the front was amateur work." Margaret's hand found the small knife in her bodice, though she knew it was useless against 3 guns. Her mind raced, looking for options, finding none. Then Scout burst through the open window. The little dog, who must have followed them despite Margaret's attempts to leave him behind, launched himself at the nearest guard with a ferocity that belied his size and injured leg. The man cursed, stumbling back, his shot going wild. In that instant of chaos, Coda struck. He threw his knife, catching the second guard in the shoulder, then lunged at Riggs. Margaret grabbed May and the bag of evidence, pushing her toward the window. "Go get the ledger to Martha." May hesitated only a second before diving through the window. Margaret turned back to see Coda and Riggs grappling for the gun. Blood seeped through Coda's shirt. His wound had reopened. She didn't think. The knife Coda had given her was in her hand, then buried in Riggs' side. He screamed, releasing the gun, which skittered across the floor. Margaret dove for it as the wounded guard tried to aim with his good arm. The shot was impossibly loud in the small room. For a moment, Margaret couldn't tell who had fired. Then the guard toppled backward, her bullet in his chest. Riggs was on his knees, clutching his side, face twisted with pain and rage. "You're dead," he snarled. "All of you. My men will hunt you down like animals." "Your men are busy." Martha's voice came from the doorway. She stood there with several armed townspeople, including some Margaret had never suspected of sympathy to their cause. Seems folks got tired of their daughters disappearing. Funny how a little proof can change minds. Behind her, Margaret could hear more commotion, shouts, running feet, the sound of fighting. But it was different now. Not just their small group against Riggs' thugs, but what sounded like half the town rising up. "The ledger," Riggs gasped. "Without it, you have nothing." "The ledger is already on its way to the federal marshal," Margaret said. "Along with testimonies from the girls you've taken, it's over." She knelt beside Coda, who was slumped against the desk, one hand pressed to his reopened wound. His eyes found hers, and he managed a slight smile. "You didn't run," he said. "I told you I don't abandon partners." She pressed her hands over his, adding pressure to the wound. "Martha, he needs—" "Already here," Martha said, ushering in Dr. Holcomb, the town's elderly physician. "Figured we'd need medical help tonight." As the doctor worked on Coda, Margaret became aware of the changing sounds outside. The fighting was dying down, replaced by voices of authority, not Riggs' men, but townspeople taking control. "Morrison made it," someone reported from the doorway. "Telegraphed from Denver. Federal marshals are already on their way. Should be here by tomorrow night." Margaret felt tears prick her eyes. They'd done it. Against all odds, they'd won. But the victory felt hollow as she watched Dr. Holcomb's grave face while he examined Coda. The wound was bad, worse than before. He'd lost a lot of blood. "He needs rest," the doctor said. "Complete rest. No movement for at least a week." "You'll have to tie him down for that," Margaret said, trying for lightness despite her fear. Coda's hand found hers, weak but warm. "Ayana," he whispered. "The ledger, did it say—" Margaret had scanned enough to know. "She's alive," she said softly. "Sold to a man in California 3 months ago. But alive." Something eased in his face, years of tension finally releasing. "We'll find her." "We will," Margaret promised. "But first, you heal." They moved him carefully to the restaurant, setting up a proper sick room in what had been the storage area. Margaret refused to leave his side, monitoring his breathing, changing bandages, forcing broth between his lips when he was conscious. The town transformed overnight. With Rigg imprisoned and awaiting the federal marshals, people who'd been afraid to speak suddenly found their voices. More evidence came to light, other ledgers, hidden victims, a web of corruption that had touched nearly every family in some way. The Vietnamese sisters Margaret had rescued were reunited with May's sister and the others from the wagon. Families torn apart began to mend. And through it all, Margaret tended to Coda, willing him to fight, to survive. On the 3rd night, his fever broke. He opened his eyes to find her asleep in the chair beside his bed, Scout curled at her feet. When he shifted, she woke instantly. "You're awake," she breathed. "You're here," he responded, as if that was more surprising. "Where else would I be?" He studied her face, the exhaustion, the worry, the relief. "You saved my life. Again." "We saved each other. That's what partners do." His hand lifted, trembling with weakness, to touch her face. "Is it over?" "This part is. Rigg will hang for what he's done. The network is broken, at least here. The girls are safe." She covered his hand with hers. "But finding Ayana, helping the others who are still out there, that work goes on. Together. If you'll have me." Instead of answering, he drew her down for a kiss, gentle and full of promise. When they parted, he was almost smiling. "My mother would say the Spirit sent you to me, that you were meant to walk this path beside me. And what do you say?" "I say my mother was a wise woman." Margaret laughed. The first real laugh she'd had in days. It woke Scout, who jumped onto the bed, tail wagging, licking both their faces with enthusiastic joy. Outside, she could hear the town awakening to its new reality. There would be trials, testimonies, the long work of healing. But for now, in this quiet room with the man she'd come to love and the future stretching before them, Margaret felt something she hadn't experienced since before the war. Peace. They had won this battle, but the war against injustice continued. There were still girls to find, wrongs to right, but they would face it together, a nurse and a warrior, bound by trust and love and a shared purpose. The federal marshals arrived the next evening to find a town already transformed. Rigg and his surviving men were handed over without incident, along with boxes of evidence that would ensure their convictions. The marshal, a stern man named Davidson, personally thanked Margaret for her courage. "You risked everything," he said. "Why?" Margaret looked across the room to where Coda sat, weak but upright, giving his own testimony. Their eyes met, and he nodded slightly, their private language of understanding. "Because someone had to," she said simply. "And because I found something here worth fighting for." The marshal followed her gaze and nodded. "The Bureau could use people like you, both of you. There are other towns like this, other operations we're trying to shut down." It was an offer worth considering. But first, there was a young Apache woman in California who needed to come home. There were families to reunite, wounds to heal, a life to build from the ashes of violence. Margaret returned to Coda's side, Scout trotting faithfully behind. Whatever came next, They would face it together. The frontier was vast and often cruel, but it was also a place where courage could triumph over corruption, where love could bloom in the unlikeliest ground. And in the growing dusk of Red Hollow, with justice finally served and hope restored, that was more than enough. The attack came at dawn, 3 days after the federal marshals had taken Rig away. Margaret woke to the sound of scouts' frantic barking and the acrid smell of smoke. She ran to the window to see flames licking at the general store across the street. "Fire!" she shouted, grabbing her medical bag and racing down the stairs. The town erupted in chaos. People stumbled from their homes, some still in nightclothes, forming bucket brigades from the water troughs. But even as they fought one fire, another would spring up: the blacksmith shop, the church, the schoolhouse. "It's Rig's men!" James Chen gasped, soot-streaked and exhausted. "The ones who got away. They're burning us out for revenge." Margaret's heart clenched. Coda was still recovering, barely able to walk. She had to get to him. She found him already outside, leaning heavily on a makeshift crutch but directing men to protect the buildings most at risk. His face was pale with pain, but his voice carried authority. "The warehouse," he said when he saw her. "They'll try to destroy the evidence we haven't sent to Denver yet." He was right. Through the smoke, Margaret could see figures moving near Rig's former headquarters. Without thinking, she ran toward them, several townspeople following. They were too late. The building was already engulfed, but Margaret saw something that made her blood run cold: movement in the upper window. Someone was trapped inside. "There's someone in there!" she shouted. Before anyone could stop her, she plunged into the burning building. The smoke was blinding, choking, but she could hear crying young voices, terrified. She found them on the second floor, huddled in a locked room, 3 girls who must have been hidden there, forgotten in the chaos of Rig's arrest. The lock wouldn't budge. Margaret grabbed a chair and smashed it against the door handle until it broke. The girls stumbled out, coughing and crying. "The stairs are blocked," one of them gasped. Margaret looked around desperately. The window, it was their only chance. She smashed the glass with the chair, looked down at the crowd gathering below. "Get a blanket," she screamed. "Something to catch them." She could see Coda down there, injured leg or not, organizing people with military precision. Within moments, they had a stretched canvas ready. "You have to jump," Margaret told the girls. "They'll catch you." One by one, terrified, but trusting. The girls jumped. Each landed safely in the makeshift net. Margaret was about to follow when a beam crashed down, blocking the window. Fire raced across the ceiling. She was trapped. Through the smoke, she saw another window, smaller, on the far wall. She crawled toward it, lungs screaming for clean air. The floor beneath her groaned ominously. Just a few more feet. The floor gave way. She fell, landing hard on the first floor, debris raining down around her. Her ankle twisted painfully, but she was alive. She could see the door, could see daylight through the smoke. She dragged herself toward it. Strong arms caught her, pulled her the rest of the way. She found herself looking up at Coda's face, etched with fear and fury. "You fool," he said roughly, but his hands were gentle as they checked her for injuries. "You beautiful, reckless fool." She tried to speak but could only cough. He carried her away from the burning building, his own injuries forgotten in his desperation to get her to safety. Dr. Holcomb was already treating the rescued girls. He took one look at Margaret and shook his head. "Smoke inhalation, burns, possible broken ankle. You're lucky to be alive." "The girls," Margaret wheezed. "Are safe, thanks to you," Martha said, appearing with water and clean bandages. "All 3 of them. Turns out Rig had a hidden room we missed. Those monsters left them to burn." The fires were finally under control as the sun climbed higher. Half the town was damaged or destroyed, but no lives had been lost. The attackers had fled back into the wilderness, but pauses were already forming to track them down. Margaret found herself in her own bed, ankles splinted, burns dressed, with strict orders to rest. Coda sat beside her, ignoring similar orders for himself. "We make quite a pair," she said, voice still hoarse. "Both of us too stubborn to stay down. The federal marshal wants to deputize us." Coda said quietly, "Both of us. Says we've proven ourselves 10 times over." Margaret studied his face. "Is that what you want?" "What I want is to find my sister, to stop this from happening to other families." He paused. "And to do it with you beside me, if you're willing." She reached for his hand. "I told you, partners." A knock at the door interrupted them. Liu Mei entered, carrying a telegram. "From San Francisco," she said, excitement brightening her face. "My uncle has connections there. He found her Ayana. She's alive, working in a laundry. Closely watched, but alive." Coda's whole body went rigid. "You're certain?" "He spoke to her himself, told her you were coming. She said to tell you the eternal bloom still grows, whatever that means." Tears ran down Coda's face, the first Margaret had ever seen from him. "It means she hasn't given up. It's what I used to tell her when she was small and things seemed hopeless, that her name meant she would always survive, always flourish." "Then we go to San Francisco," Margaret said firmly, "as soon as we can travel." Coda looked at her. "Your life is here. The town needs you." "The town has Dr. Holcomb, and Martha has proven she can handle anything." Margaret struggled to sit up. "My life is where you are, where this work takes us. I thought we'd established that." Martha appeared in the doorway. "If you're going to San Francisco, you'll need help. The Washburns want to go, their daughter might be there too, and the Chen family, and probably half a dozen others who've gotten word their girls might be on the coast." "A rescue party," Coda murmured. "More like a small army," Martha corrected. "Folks are tired of waiting for justice. They want to take action." Over the next week, as Margaret and Coda healed, plans took shape. The federal marshal, Davidson, officially deputized them both, giving them the authority they'd need. Families contributed funds. The rescued girls provided information about the operations in San Francisco. One of them, Jenny Patterson, insisted on coming along. "I know the man who has Ayana," she said. "Patrick Murphy. He owns several establishments. I can help you find them." The night before their departure, the town held a gathering. Not a celebration, too much had been lost for that, but an acknowledgement. The mayor, finally free of Riggs' influence, presented Margaret and Coda with official commendations. "You gave us back our conscience," he said simply, "reminded us that staying silent in the face of evil makes us complicit." Later, Margaret and Coda walked slowly through the town, Scout limping along beside them. The burned buildings were already being rebuilt, stronger than before. Where fear had once ruled, determination had taken its place. "Are you ready for this?" Coda asked. "San Francisco is a dangerous city. What we're attempting is necessary," Margaret finished. "And we're not attempting it alone. Look around us. Coda, look what we've built." He was quiet for a moment. "I came here seeking vengeance. Alone, angry, trusting no one. You changed that." "We changed each other," Margaret corrected. "That's what partners do," he finished, and she could hear the smile in his voice. "Yes, I'm learning." They stopped at the edge of town, looking out at the vast frontier stretching before them. Somewhere out there, Ayana waited. Somewhere, other girls were trapped, other families torn apart. The work would be dangerous, possibly endless. But they wouldn't face it alone. Behind them stood a town reborn. Ahead lay allies they hadn't yet met, and beside each other they had found something worth any risk. "Margaret," Coda said suddenly, "when this is over, when we find Ayana and the others." "Yes." He turned to face her, his dark eyes serious. "I want to do this right. The Apache way and the White way both. I want everyone to know that you are mine and I am yours, that we stand together in all things." Margaret's heart skipped. "Are you asking what I think you're asking?" "I'm saying that when we return, I want Martha to help plan a wedding. If you'll have me." She answered by pulling him down for a kiss, pouring all her love and certainty into it. Scout barked approvingly, dancing around their feet despite his healing leg. "Yes," she said when they parted. 1,000 times yes." They stood there as the stars emerged, two souls who had found each other across a divide of culture and circumstance. Tomorrow would bring new challenges: the journey to San Francisco, the dangerous rescue attempt, the ongoing fight against those who would prey on the innocent. But tonight, with the rebuilt town at their backs and the future spread before them, they had each other. And that was enough to face whatever came. The next morning, their party set out 12 riders, including Margaret and Coda, the Washburns, the Chens, Marshall Davidson, and others who had personal stakes in the mission. Jenny Patterson rode with grim determination, maps of San Francisco tucked in her saddlebags. As they left Red Hollow, Margaret looked back one last time. The town had been forever changed by their actions, just as she had been changed. She'd come seeking escape and found purpose, seeking solitude and found love, seeking peace and found a war worth fighting. Coda rode beside her, his recovery nothing short of miraculous, driven by the knowledge that his sister was within reach. He caught her look and nodded their silent understanding deeper than ever. "No regrets?" he asked. "None," Margaret replied. "Only anticipation." The road to San Francisco would be long and dangerous. Patrick Murphy's operation would be well guarded. The city authorities possibly corrupt. They were riding into the unknown with only their courage and conviction to guide them. But they rode together, white and Apache, men and women, united by shared loss and common purpose. They rode for justice, for reunion, for the chance to right terrible wrongs. And as the sun climbed higher, painting the desert in shades of gold and crimson, Margaret knew with bone-deep certainty that they would succeed. Not because the fight would be easy, but because it was necessary. Not because they were without fear, but because love and determination were stronger than fear could ever be. The eternal bloom would grow again. They would make sure of it. The journey to San Francisco took 3 weeks, each day bringing new challenges and revelations. They rescued 2 more girls along the way, one from a traveling merchant who'd bought her in Nevada, another found wandering the desert after escaping her captors. Each story added fuel to their determination. When they finally crested the last hill and saw the city spread before them, Margaret felt both hope and trepidation. San Francisco was vast, chaotic, a maze of streets and alleys where fortunes were made and lost, where law struggled to keep pace with growth. They made camp outside the city to plan their approach. Jenny Patterson spread out her hand-drawn maps, marking locations where Murphy operated his establishments. "He has 5 main buildings," she explained, her voice steady despite the memories that must haunt her. "But the main one, where he keeps the newest arrivals, is here near the wharf. That's where Ayanna will be." "Security?" Marshall Davidson asked. "Heavy," Murphy learned from Riggs' mistakes. "Guards at every entrance, more inside, and he pays the local police to look the other way." "Then we need a different approach," Coda said, studying the map intently. "Not force, but stealth." Margaret had been thinking the same thing. What if we didn't attack at all? What if we simply visited? The others looked at her in confusion. But she continued. "Jenny, these establishments, they have customers, don't they? People who come and go?" Understanding dawned on Jenny's face. "Yes, rich men mostly. Some bring their wives to show off their wealth." "Then that's our way in. A wealthy couple, looking for domestic help." Margaret looked at Coda. "We go in as customers, locate Ayanna and any others, then signal the rest of you." "Too dangerous," Coda said immediately. "If they recognize us." "They won't. It's been months. We're far from Red Hollow, and they won't expect us to walk through the front door. She touched his hand. Trust me. The next 2 days were spent in preparation. Margaret and Coda acquired appropriate clothing, she in an elegant dress that made her feel like a fraud. He in a suit that he wore with obvious discomfort. They crafted a story wealthy ranch owners from Texas, in the city, to hire domestic staff. The night of their infiltration, Margaret could barely breathe through her corset. Scout had to be left with Martha, much to his vocal displeasure. The rest of their party took positions around the building, ready to act on their signal. Murphy's establishment looked respectable. From the outside, a large Victorian house with manicured gardens. Only the bars on the upper windows suggested anything amiss. A doorman admitted them, eyeing Coda with suspicion that Margaret quickly diverted. "My husband has particular ideas about security," she said with practiced arrogance. "He insists on inspecting any establishment personally before we do business." They were led to a plush waiting room where other customers sat. Margaret's skin crawled, but she maintained her pose. After an interminable wait, a man emerged, Patrick Murphy himself. Jenny had confirmed from her hidden position outside. He was smaller than Margaret had expected, with cold eyes that reminded her uncomfortably of Rigg. "Mr. and Mrs. Hutchinson," he greeted them, using their false names. "I understand you're looking for domestic help." "Several positions," Margaret said smoothly. "Our ranch is expanding. We need reliable workers." Murphy's smile was oily. "Of course. We have many suitable candidates. Perhaps you'd like to meet some—" They were led through the building, past rooms where young women sat in enforced idleness. Margaret memorized every face, every exit, every guard position. Coda walked beside her, tension radiating from him despite his calm expression. Then they entered a room, and Margaret heard Coda's sharp intake of breath. Ayanna sat by the window, thinner than the sketches Coda had shown her, but unmistakably his sister. Her eyes, so like her brother's, widened in shock before she quickly looked down. "This one is Apache," Murphy was saying. "Quite skilled with needlework. She'd make an excellent—" "We'll take her," Coda said, his voice rough. Murphy's eyes sharpened. "She's one of our more expensive acquisitions. The price—" "Is no object," Margaret interjected. "My husband has taken a liking to her. We'll pay your price." "Excellent. Shall we discuss terms in my office?" This was the dangerous part. They followed Murphy deeper into the building, passing more guards, more locked doors. In his office, Murphy named an outrageous sum. "Of course," Margaret agreed. "We'll need to retrieve funds from our hotel. Can we return tomorrow to complete the transaction?" Murphy's suspicion was obvious now. "I prefer immediate payment." "And I prefer to inspect what I'm buying," Coda said, standing. "We'll return tomorrow. Have her ready." They were almost to the door when Murphy spoke again. "Hutchinson. Unusual name for a man of your appearance." Margaret's hand found the derringer hidden in her dress, but Coda simply turned, his expression cold. "I was adopted young by a white family," he said. "They gave me their name and their fortune. Any other questions?" The lie was delivered with such conviction that Murphy stepped back. "No, of course not. Until tomorrow." They made it outside, walking calmly until they turned the corner. Then Coda grabbed Margaret, holding her tight. "She's alive," he whispered, voice breaking. "She recognized me. She's alive. And tomorrow, she'll be free," Margaret promised. "All of them will be." They met the others at the prearranged location. Marshal Davidson listened to their report, nodding grimly. "He'll be ready for us tomorrow. This Murphy isn't stupid." "Then we don't wait until tomorrow," Coda said. "We go tonight, while he thinks we're coming back." "The building is a fortress," Jenny protested. "All those guards—" "Who are watching for an attack from outside," Margaret said, understanding Coda's plan. Not for someone already inside to let others in. Liu Mei stepped forward. My uncle's friends in Chinatown. They know the building's servants, the ones who clean, who bring food. They could get us inside. The plan came together quickly, using Mei's connections. They arranged for several of their party to enter as night cleaning staff. Margaret and Coda would return as the Hutchinsons, ostensibly to complete the purchase, but really to create a distraction. Just after midnight, they put the plan into action. The cleaning staff, actually the Washburns and 2 other rescue party members, entered through the service entrance. Margaret and Coda approached the front door. We couldn't wait, Margaret told the surprised doorman. My husband is so taken with that Apache girl. We have the money. Greed overcame caution. They were admitted, led once again to Murphy's office. He was there, despite the late hour, clearly having expected some kind of treachery. Mr. and Mrs. Hutchinson, he said, a pistol obvious on his desk. How eager you are. Very eager, Margaret agreed. At that moment, they heard the signal 3 short whistle blasts. Their people were in position. Murphy heard it too. His hand went for the pistol, but Coda was faster. The 2 men crashed together, fighting for the weapon. Margaret pulled her derringer, covering the door as shouts erupted throughout the building. The rescue party struck simultaneously at multiple points. Guards, caught off balance, found themselves facing determined parents and federal lawmen. Locked doors were broken down, girls freed, chains cut. Murphy managed to throw Coda off, raising the pistol. Margaret didn't hesitate. Her shot caught him in the shoulder, spinning him around. The pistol fell from nerveless fingers. It's over, she told him as Coda retrieved the weapon. Your whole operation, your network, it's finished. Through the door burst Marshal Davidson, the Chens, and Margaret's heart soared Ayanna, supported by Jenny Patterson. The reunion between brother and sister was everything Margaret had hoped for. They fell into each other's arms, years of separation dissolving in tears and whispered words in their native language. You came, Ayanna said in English, looking at Margaret. He told me someone would come, but I had stopped believing. He never stopped, Margaret said. Never stopped searching, never stopped hoping. The building was secured within an hour. 32 girls were freed that night, some who'd been captive for years. Murphy and his men were arrested, facing federal charges that would ensure they never hurt anyone again. As dawn broke over San Francisco Bay, the rescue party gathered at the docks. Reunited families wept together. Those whose families couldn't be found were taken in by others, promised homes and safety. Margaret stood with Coda and Ayanna, watching the sun paint the water gold. Scout, who'd somehow escaped Martha's care and found them in the city, sat at their feet, tail wagging contentedly. What now? Ayanna asked. She was 17 now, no longer the child who'd been stolen, but a young woman shaped by hardship. Now we go home, Coda said, to Red Hollow, and we rebuild. All of us. She looked between her brother and Margaret, a knowing smile touching her lips. I heard you found more than just me on your journey. Margaret blushed, but Coda pulled her close. I found everything, he said simply. They were married a month later in Red Hollow, in a ceremony that blended Apache traditions with frontier customs. The whole town attended, including all the rescued girls who'd chosen to stay and build new lives. Ayanna stood as Margaret's maid of honor, the medicine pouch that had connected them now worn proudly around her neck. Scout bore the rings on a ribbon around his neck, limping down the aisle with great dignity, as they exchanged vows beside the creek where they'd first begun to trust each other. Margaret thought about the journey that had brought them here. She'd come west broken by war, seeking escape. Instead, she'd found purpose, love, and a family built not just on blood but on choice. You may kiss your bride, the minister said, and Coda did, thoroughly, to the cheers of the crowd. That evening, as the celebration continued around them, Margaret and Coda slipped away to the small house they'd built by the river. It was simple but solid, with room to grow. Windows facing both the sunrise and sunset. "Do you regret it?" Coda asked as they sat on the porch, watching the stars emerge. "The danger, the fights, all we went through." Margaret thought of the girls they'd saved, the families reunited, the love they'd found. She thought of Ayanna, laughing with other young women her age, free to choose her own path. She thought of Red Hollow, transformed from a place of fear to one of hope. "Not for a moment," she said, leaning into his warmth. "Every scar was worth it." "Even mine." He touched his chest where her stitches had saved his life. "Especially yours. They led you to me." Scout climbed onto the porch, settling between them with a contented sigh. In the distance, they could hear music from the ongoing celebration, voices raised in joy rather than fear. They had started as strangers divided by prejudice and pain. They would continue as partners united by love and purpose. The frontier was still wild, still dangerous, but no longer hopeless. Together, they would face whatever came next. Together, they would build something lasting in this harsh land. And together, they would ensure that the eternal bloom of hope would never again be crushed by those who traded in human misery. As the stars wheeled overhead and the night deepened around them, Margaret and Coda sat in peaceful silence, hands intertwined, hearts finally home. The war against injustice would continue, but tonight was for celebrating victory, love, and the proof that even in the darkest places, light could take root and flourish. Tomorrow would bring new challenges. Tonight brought only gratitude for the winding path that had led two wounded souls to healing, and to each other. In the wild heart of the frontier, they had written their own story, and it was only the beginning. Thank you so much for listening to this story from the American frontier. I'd love to hear where in the world you're listening from. Please share in the comments below so we can connect and exchange thoughts about Margaret and Coda's journey. If you enjoyed this tale of love and justice in the Old West, please subscribe to Wild West Stories 1850. Hit that like button. And don't forget to click the hype button to help more people discover these stories of courage and redemption from America's past.